Good afternoon if you're in Europe. Good morning if you're in Asia. This is Mike Rosenberg. I'm a strategy professor at IESE Business School. And if you haven't been watching our series of webinars, we are running a series of them to try to help people, help managers mainly cope with what they need to cope with during this terrible crisis caused by COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 or whatever you want to call this virus. IESE Business School is doing this because we think people are in need of listening to different experts from different functions, different aspects of management, which is kind of what we do. The broadcast is running live on LinkedIn. It's also available on IESE's YouTube channel, and La Vanguardia, a newspaper here in Barcelona, is also publishing these videos. You can watch this one and other ones. They're all taped, and you can also watch them at the IESE Business School website, where we have a special place where we're collecting all of this stuff. Today, I'm with Anneloes Raes. Anneloes is Dutch. She's a professor in our managing people division. She's done her master's in psychology, her doctoral work in organizational behavior. She spends most of her time, besides teaching in our programs, she spends most of her time looking at the management teams and what they have to do and how they have to behave from the board of directors all the way down in the organization. Anneloes, as a student of this stuff, if you think about businesses and if you think of kind of the trend line, if we go before the current crisis, what was keeping human resources managers or CEOs, when they pay attention to these kinds of issues, which I think they should do a lot, what was keeping them awake? What were some of the issues in kind of managing global companies, 4 weeks ago or 5 weeks ago?
Thanks for having me, Mike. Yeah, I was also thinking about it in preparing this talk, like what we're seeing now is unprecedented. What does it mean for leadership? And I was thinking back concretely to a talk that I did at Microsoft Germany's headquarters in Munich. And I was giving a talk to a series of, to a group of people working in the tech sector, technology, and we were basically starting from numbers like this. And I said, okay, we need to think about how you lead people. People have high expectations. We were thinking on millennials, tight labor markets. And I showed these numbers, which are for European workers from Kelly Global Workforce Index, but that are just the same if you look at it from other regions of the world, where many people said what we want more as compared to what we have now is a highly collaborative environment. We want a culture of innovation and creativity. We want flexible work arrangements. So this is where we continued discussing, spending the talk. And the conclusion of that really was that as a leader, you need to be kind of brave, because a lot is asked in terms of relying on your people, asking for feedback, thinking about how you frame situations, etc. And it's 4 weeks ago. So coronavirus, COVID-19 was there. We were talking about it, but still, it's amazing still how quickly the world has changed and what we have seen. And that talk was called New Leadership. And if I'm thinking now in preparing that talk, we are living something that is very new and which might be very different from what we saw before. But just one silver lining that I would like to point out right away already is, if you see these numbers, people want collaboration, innovation, creativity, flexibility. Some of that unwanted. We didn't choose this crisis and we didn't want it. We would have chosen against it, but who knows? Some of the things that we are learning and developing during this crisis may come in handy if we get out of that again in who knows whatever time. So this, I guess, is the benchmark of leadership that we were thinking about until a couple of weeks ago still.
No, Anneloes, I'd rather say when we come out of the crisis, but that's my own bias. By the way, if you're on the LinkedIn platform, you can use the chat feature to ask questions. I see lots of people from all over the world saying hello to each other, which is fine. But if you do have a question for me or for Anneloes Raes, please type it into the chat function. We actually have a system. I'm going to get those questions on my iPad, so I'll be able to ask them with Anneloes in the second part of the broadcast. We'll start with kind of her main message, and then we'll go to your questions. So, Anneloes, if that's what the situation was 4 weeks ago, from a managing people and organizations perspective, which is I think your perspective, what changes with the virus? What's where are we now?
Yeah, I guess sometimes I'm thinking that where many of us are now, depending a little bit, obviously, on where you live. In China, many people are coming out of their confinement. We're here in Spain, we're still in the middle of it. Maybe in other countries, you're even still
Sorry,
in an
Annalise,
earlier
we're looking
stage.
at what kind of animal is that? There's a
Yeah,
very frightened looking animal.
yeah.
I think the guy who's looking at him is the fox. Who's that?
Yeah, I was thinking this picture is just so applicable to how many of us might feel right now. So this photograph is called The Moment, and it was the winning photo of the Wildlife Photographer of the Year award in 2019. And here you see a marmot basically caught, paralyzed in the moment, realizing that it's being threatened by the fox. I don't know what happened afterwards.
Because
So
foxes eat marmots, I guess, right?
I would say I'm not a biologist, but I would assume that as well.
Okay.
But I thought the picture very vividly kind of captured the idea that we were maybe, and we could have been prepared, but we were not. So for many of us, when we entered in this situation, it was a little bit like this shock, and it was this paralysis. And I think now more and more, of course, what you see happening is that people are starting to make sense, to share information, to share experiences, to experiment, and you're seeing quite a bit of kind of content coming up. So if you follow basically what our magazines like The Economist, here you see an excerpt, and what many other media are talking about when it comes to managing people priorities, are topics related like people's health. How can I protect my people? How can I ensure that there is safety in the culture, in the individual protections of the people? How can I ensure the mental health of the people? Other big topic, workforce adjustment. Obviously, depending also here very much on the company that you're working on. As we know, those of us working in hospitals or in other kind of considered vital organizations, they face a very high pressure. They may be thinking about and worried about, what if a large proportion, if our people get sick, how can we ensure that we have enough people to get the key parts of the work done? As we know, there's also, unfortunately, a lot of examples of businesses who are thinking about the other way. Restaurants, all of those situations, sports clubs who are fully closed, fully out of business, and who have to think on the opposite direction. How, if I cannot pay them anymore, how can I either make use of the labor regulations that are there, the
Yeah, this came
adjustments?
up in our the conversation I had with Professor Javier Santoma from the
Yeah.
finance group, and his vision, Annalise, is a business has to make sure that they have enough cash after the crisis to open up again, and he sees the ethical responsibility of any business owner, any CEO, is to make sure the business will survive, so that those jobs will be there at the end of the crisis, and it's a tough call, but I think everybody has to make it.
I think that's exactly, you need to juggle kind of very short-term priorities, and then also at the same time, because yes, of course we will get out of this crisis. If why I was saying if, that was not intentional, because we will get out of it, and there will be a life after that, and you will not want to be paralyzed at that stage again by what is happening. So for sure you want to plan with both the short and the long term in mind. Many of us are still working, like us, working from home, do trying to fulfill the primary purposes of our work. We're thinking of communication. How can we support people? How can we make sure that everybody has kind of the digital means to work at home? Virtual teams, I know you've talked about that before also with one of my colleagues. The hardware, the software, IT departments of companies also. This is also another group of employees who are working very, very hard to make everything work. And within all that, it's clear that, and this is also what you see more and more. I read somewhere lately who said, okay, in the prior crisis that we had, the financial crisis in 2008, everybody looked at the CFO and our financial people to see how we would solve it. Now they look at the people, maybe corporate HR, CEOs, leaders, obviously. I think this is very, very much I mean, we're facing many issues, but definitely how we deal with our
Right.
people
So
is a key
Anneloes,
thing.
you know, this broadcast, we put it open source on LinkedIn and on YouTube and La Vanguardia. But you know, thinking about our own alumni, we have 50,000 men and women all over the world. Many of them are people, to use your words. Um, and then of course the senior management has to be talking with the people and be working together with them. From that perspective, what should the people be doing, and what should the CEO be focusing on? And I think you've been working, because I think many people have been using this time to do some creative work. I think you've been doing some creative work on building kind of a model, or the start of a model about what people should do. Could you share that with us?
Yeah, so that would be, I gave it an acronym, and it's called the CARE model. So as I will explain, it stands basically by 4 different actions or steps that you can take. I mean, of course, there's a million different things that you could do or that you should be doing. But out of all of those, I thought I'd highlight 4 that I see as kind of key steps for these people to take care of their people both now and also to ensure hopefully their work in the long run. So I dubbed it the CARE model because I think in that word basically is already the main message of the model. I think this is very much a time in which we should care for our people. We should do that always, obviously. That is not something that now all of a sudden should have come up. In fact, if me and my colleagues, if we're teaching our course in leadership to our first year MBA students, the conclusion of our first class is always, well, people are people. This may sound
And
obvious,
and
but
and Luz, if I could say, we had a wonderful session in Spanish by Iago de la Cerva in the series, where he talked about the importance in communication of being close to people, and giving them the feeling that you are with them and you are
yes.
close to them. And by the way, on Monday at 4 o'clock, we'll have Carnel giving a similar speech in English about the way to communicate in times of crisis. But please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that is very important because we might, of course, if I'm saying people are people, I mean, I'm sure many of you are thinking, yeah, duh, it couldn't be more obvious. But I think in the reality of our lives and of our work, sometimes we do think of people as maybe resources or instruments towards our own goals, organizational goals, team goals, etc. But people respond um, best if they are treated as people. There was, in fact, you've probably heard that quote many times. It was by Peter Drucker, a famous management thinker, who said, people have a tendency to behave as human beings. What does that mean? Well, we have emotions. Right now, many people might be afraid, they might be anxious, they might be sad, they might be worried. Well, also we have a home life. I remember there was that video probably a year ago of that BBC reporter whose 4-year-old child came into the room when he was broadcasting live. And at that time, that was big news. But right now, I think for many of us, in many of the calls that we have with our colleagues, that is happening. We know about
Well,
our colleague.
your son's having a guitar lesson right now, if I remember
Yeah,
right. So we don't
yeah,
have to worry
yeah.
about him, right?
No, they are under very, both my sons are under very strict, and my husband are under strict restrictions to stay out of the room. But who knows? Who knows? Let's see. So that is the reality of how we communicate now. We come to know how our colleagues' home situations look like, and what they imply for our work much more than they did, and that's just a reality. I mean, and of course, in normal life, let's say in pre-crisis situations, people also had a home life. They also had other things to do besides their work, but it just didn't interfere with work as much as it does right now in that current situation. And that is a reality. Other people might not have children, but they might be by themselves. They might be lonely. They might be worried. They might have no one to balance it out with. And that is a reality of how it is. And that's also why it is important, if you treat your people as people, you treat them with care, you care for them, you take care of them, all things will go better, because that's just the nature of how you achieve things when you're working with people. And
Okay,
also
so
maybe,
what does the C stand for in your model?
Yes. So the C, but let me say maybe just one thing before I go there, because I think it's also important if you say, I mean, you need to care for your people. You also need to be sure you care for yourself as well as a leader, not because you're kind of an egoistic, centered person, but what people many times use is when we think of the emergency constructions instructions in airplanes, and we say before you help others, be sure to put up your own oxygen mask. And that's certainly a message that I would like to give to all of you who are people. A lot if is being asked from you. It's very important that you take care of yourself in order to take care of other people. So we go to the C. The C I have found to stand for control emotional contagion. So we'll go through these 4 steps one by one. Control emotional contagion. This is another thing that I always say to my students. Make sure you manage emotions before they manage you. And that is your own emotions, and that is also other people's emotions. And the thing with emotions is that they are contagious. Obviously, we're now talking these days about the contagion of the virus, and we talk about flattening the curve and all of that. But also, emotions tend to spread very quickly, and negative emotions probably even faster than positive emotions. And that is a reality of how your organizations look like. Some organizations I know have people analytics in place that can capture quite well how people are doing, for example. So if you have that in your organization, this could certainly be a way to get that. But you don't need that in order to know, as you mentioned from the seminar you had with Jago, with the seminar you have with Connor. If you just make sure you check in with your people, with your teams, to hear how people are doing, that is very important to make sure that negative emotions don't spiral out of control. Why is that
Anneloes,
important? Mm-hmm.
there's a question from Jose Luis about fear. I mean, how do you
Yes.
manage fear? How do you recognize when it's around, and how do you stop fear from spreading? Because there is so much uncertainty right now.
Yes, there is a lot of uncertainty. Many people are afraid of the uncertainty. How long will it last? Will I get sick? How are my parents doing? I'm living far away from them. How? So that is something that, it, I mean, for sure, I would seek the conversation. I would regularly check in with people, because what might happen if people are afraid or are particularly worried or anxious, they will likely have a difficulty to focus at work. And that is something that you can see. If you're having a chat with your team, if you're seeing that someone promises to do the thing but doesn't do something else. I even had people so far kind of checking in on me saying, hey, Anneloes, you're normally very fast with your emails. I haven't heard from you from a few days. Are you doing well? So these are things that you can do. And that does not mean, obviously, that you can take away the fear or you can cancel out the fear, because it is a situation that is frightening, but at least you can be there. You can talk about it. You can encourage other people to talk about it. And what I think you can also do is to see if you can at least instill maybe some positive emotions, maybe some fun, some humor, understanding, caring for each other. And by that, you can hopefully try to neutralize a little bit all the negative emotions that are also around.
No, at least there's
Mm,
two more questions on this, about emergency workers, healthcare people, and people who are in the food industry and other businesses which are being asked to stay open. You're
yes.
asking people to come to work
Mm,
when many people are home.
mm.
How do you control the emotional fear or the anger perhaps they have of saying, why do I have to go to work if it's not safe?
Yes, definitely. This is something that I'm seeing it if I'm doing my grocery shopping. I'm living close to a small street where everybody knows everybody. I I mean, this is a topic that I hear every day. If I'm buying my vegetables, I'm buying my bread. You see it in people. They are afraid. I guess what ultimately these people say, and what of course as a manager you could also do, is to tap into you're saying, okay, you're doing something that is really key for other people, for society. This is sometimes in the terminology of leadership. So for those of you who are watching with a leadership course under your belt, I'm sure you know the term. We call this altruistic or transcendent motivation. We get motivated to do something when we know that this helps others. And I think that's at least what I'm hearing from the woman at my bakery who says, okay, I am afraid, I wouldn't want to work, but I cannot leave all of you here. I've also heard this a similar framing from a managing director of a company that I'm working with a lot, and they're working in the food industry. So they are breeding vegetable seeds. I mean, this managing director is giving a message every few days to the people of this company, basically stating, okay, the 600 million people are eating the vegetables that are basically growing from our seeds. We need to ensure that people continue eating. That doesn't mean that the fear is away, but at least if people are able to connect it to kind of a clear and compelling reason and purpose of why they're doing what they're doing, at least you can probably make sure that they're doing their work with a sense of purpose and understanding that it's not easy. They have every reason to be afraid, but they're doing it for a reason. Which is not to say that you shouldn't also take good you should take good measures in terms of think about every protection, whatever it is in the setting that is most relevant. Put up screens, have people wear masks.
But that comes in under A, right? Because doing stuff is A, if I remember right.
Yes, exactly. That would definitely be something which I called act and learn. So in the pre-corona times, there was always also a lot of talk about agile leadership, even to basically people saying, okay, please don't mention anything about agile. I'm sick of agile. What is it in the first place? But I think some of the elements of that come in handy right now. In particular, I think given the uncertainty that we have, it's very important to not be as the marmot that is paralyzed. You need to act, but also you need to recognize that you are probably very likely gonna be needing to update your acting, your behavior, because situations change so fastly by the day. So you need to very explicitly build in a phase of learning, acting, learning, acting, learning, both in your attitudes and also in your behavior. You can even do it at home. I try to install it also. We go through the day, you evaluate a little bit, what went well today, what do we need to do again tomorrow? And then a check-in in the morning again, how is everybody doing? What is the plan for today? What did we learn from yesterday? And I know there's many people that work in teams that are also working in exactly that way. And this is a way of working which even in pre-corona times worked well for stimulating innovation and creativity, and which also works now in a time when there is uncertainty and lots of things that we don't know yet. So this is basically this tendency. Sometimes I know in strategy, my people call it ambidexterity, and they say, okay, we are in a situation where we need to execute and innovate at exactly the same time. How do you do it?
Now, one thing I was running a session with our global executive MBA an hour or two ago, and one of the participants who works in the food business, they had the issue of the office staff is home, but the factory people are working, and that creates a certain issue. And their solution was that all the managers have taken up jobs on the assembly line.
Oh, fantastic.
All the managers are working, side by side with their people, wearing the same masks and the same gloves. And the way those guys acted, and to show that they care, was to say, I'll be standing right beside you.
That sends a very strong signal. And this is also one of the things you mentioned it in the introduction. If I'm studying my management teams, I oftentimes say, as an executive, but also as an executive team, you have a role model function for the rest of the organization. People look at you. People don't only listen to what you say, but they especially listen to what you do. And I think the example you're citing now is exactly an example of a very positive role model of someone saying, okay, I know you have a difficult time. Also, I know other organizations are doing creative things even out of necessity, because imagine if at that line people get sick, then it might be an absolute necessity to have people with office jobs standing in. I've heard a company also creating, let's say, an internal agency of sorts to say that, to make it possible for people to say, okay, I may be working at a function or at a type of position which right now is not as crucial as other positions in the situation. Can I maybe step in? Is there something I can do? What if a considerable amount of our people get sick? How can we stand in? So I certainly think there's lots of creative possibilities there.
Okay, what's the R stand for?
Yes, so we get to the R, and that would be rely on others. And this, I guess, touches upon an interesting balance that is a challenge for people in good times and a topic of endless sessions as a leader. Should I be more directive or should I be more empowering and allow people to participate? And of course, the question is always, you probably need both of those things, but maybe not exactly at the same time. Now, what we know in times of crisis, and there has been quite a bit of research in this, for example, after the Brexit vote, after 9/11. So there have been researchers who have illustrated that, in fact, in times of crisis, leaders get more directive in their approach. That's for some reason a natural tendency, and it also stays a bit like that. So it's not only in face of the immediate crisis, but it's kind of a longer term change or change in preference for a directive leadership style. And that is
on that, Francisco's asking, is this a test, this teleworking of how much trust there is between managers and employees?
Yeah, you could certainly see it like that, a very unintended one. But I guess, I mean, if you didn't yet trust your people, this, which of course nobody would say, yeah, but everybody trusts people, I guess, in theory. But if you have found it hard to give up control, to not be able to exactly monitor what your people are doing, well, this, you could see this as an interesting test case, I guess.
Yeah, another question in the same line is how do you keep engagement going when you
Yes.
don't see people anymore?
Yes. And I would say this is probably where the empowerment comes in, because what you need in these times is you need action, and sometimes quick actions. And sometimes as a leader, you need to be directive. You need to stop discussions. You need to make decisions. You need to provide very, very clear ways forward. But what is also very important is, if you want to get that creativity and that innovation that is necessary in many of the organizations that we have, you also need a type of empowerment, which basically means that you give the initiative to the people that are doing the work. You allow them a bit of leeway to come up with new proposals. I was thinking on the, do you know, in what was it, in 2010, I guess, when we had that terrible disaster with the people who were trapped in the mine in Chile.
Yeah.
And that was also an example where they had to come up with a very creative solution. And I think it was in the end a very new worker of 23 who came with a solution of how they could reach the place where the people were trapped with the drilling. So if you would have relied on only a very directive leadership style, you might not have had that person coming up in that way with a solution.
The other thing that another thing that's come up in this series is sometimes the people you need on your crisis committee need to be more flexible, perhaps younger people ready to break the rules, people who can do things fast and see connections. And then at some point when the solution is in place, maybe it's time to give it back to the line management. But it's a very interesting balance about creativity and trust.
Yeah, but I wouldn't necessarily say that creativity would only be something that we should rely on for the young and the tech savvy type of people, because creativity also often comes with having a lot of experience and being able to combine elements that you haven't combined in that way before. So I guess it can get both ways. You need the creative thinking, you need out of the box, you need a fresh perspective, you need these people who ask, well, why not? But at the same time, you also, if you could have in that crisis management team the people that can at the same time basically very quickly go back and forth between what is new, what is tried and tested, what information what capabilities do we have in the organization, how can we use that in a creative way? This is where probably you will come up with the best solutions, I guess.
So it's control emotions, act and learn, rely on others, and now we need an E to spell out care.
Yeah, we need an E. So envision the future. This is also something that is very, very important, because we don't know what will happen. We don't know how long it will take to get out of the confinement of the specific situations where we are. We've reached every time we read the news, there's lots of speculation, there's scenarios, there's interpretation of the numbers. So we don't know how the future looks like. But what should we do in these times of uncertainty? Our colleagues from the decision-making department would have basically one easy answer, and they say scenario planning. If you don't know what will happen, you need to start working on scenarios, not general scenarios in the sense of what if the virus, if we can go to work again in April or in May or whatnot, but very specific scenarios with in place the parameters that are relevant for your company. What does it mean if you own a restaurant? What does it mean if you can open again in June? What if you can open only in September? What if you, who knows? What if in the post COVID-19 world, we don't go to restaurants anymore? Who knows? It's not a matter of knowing. It's not a matter of pretending as a leader that you have all the answers, but it is necessary, let's say, to start preparing yourself for whatever it is that we cannot exactly prepare. So scenario planning. And then it's also very important, I guess, that you have a narrative for your people. We were touching already a little bit on it when we talked about how do you engage people? How do you deal with people that are afraid? And I think it's very important as a people manager to say, what is it that we are doing right now? You are there in the bakery, in the front line, in the supermarket. Why are we doing that? Well, that is because we have a responsibility to feed people. So I think it's very important for people to get this sense and this understanding of why are we doing what we're doing. There is also a very interesting article by two colleagues from the US, Ryan Quinn and Monica Warline, who analyzed the conversation patterns that took place inside the United Airlines flight 93. So as I'm sure you know, this was the flight that was steering towards the White House after on 9/11, basically, but where basically the passengers of that flight were able to get into the cockpit where the hijackers basically had taken over control and steer it into a field, which was a tragic, very tragic incident, obviously in itself. But what these colleagues did was that they analyzed the conversations that were going on in the plane, which they knew because people had been making phone calls with home. And out of that, they could develop a sort of constructions of how people were understanding the situation and how that guided their action. And you see a very interesting pattern between how people initially thought, okay, this is a, well, first they were thinking this is a normal flight. Then they were thinking, well, this is a hijacking situation, up until at a certain point they realized, okay, this is a suicide mission. And from those narratives of what is going on, they could kind of mobilize collective action in a way that ultimately allowed them to overpower the hijackers. So as a leader, it's very important that you give a narrative of what's going on in your organization, not, as I said, to pretend that you know everything, that you control everything, but just in a way to say, okay, this is what is happening, we're working on it. I'm keeping you posted on whatever happens, and then spell out what it means for each individual person.
Okay, Anneloes, could you go back to the chart which has all four, the whole model? Yeah, and I've got a whole bunch of questions, if you don't mind, from
Sure.
the people watching on LinkedIn, and we have almost more than 1,100 people watching the program. Maybe the first question, because you just mentioned this, should a manager, display their uncertainty or even their anxiety, or does a manager have to kind of be calm and everything's cool and everything's under control?
Yeah, so I would probably go back here to that saying where you say you want to manage your emotions before they manage you. So I wouldn't necessarily hide my emotions, but I also would be sure, on the other hand, that your behavior is not ruled by your emotions. Because what we know, for example, by very negative emotions, if people are afraid, fear elicits a very kind of short-sighted way of thinking. So if you realize as a manager that for some reason you are at that particular day or in that particular phase, you are very afraid yourself, I would probably make sure that you kind of blow off some steam with someone that you trust before you address your people. But then if you're doing that, and I'm sure this is exactly something where maybe Connor next week is going to be talking about much more because he's a super expert in communication, but you can say to people, I know you're afraid, I'm afraid myself, but this is what we're going to do. But this is different from standing there trembling, sweating from fear, just to get the difference. So it's okay
Yeah.
to describe your emotions, because that will allow for a connection with others who are likely experiencing similar emotions, but then not let them control you, because that will ultimately limit it will limit your actions, and it will limit the options and the creativity of ideas that you're seeing.
Now, there's a bunch of questions, Anneloes. You talked about staying engaged with people and staying close to them and showing you care. You know, all these human emotions and how to communicate more human emotions online. Can you talk a little bit about is that a contradiction in terms somehow, and how can you kind of figure out, how do I show people I'm close to them if they're in their house and I'm in my house and we only see each other digitally?
Yeah. Well, it's a matter, I guess there are limitations. If you're reading an email and a person is saying, okay, everything is fine, I'm feeling perfect, then you have no, if you could see the person and you have known this person for a while, you can see that the person might not be okay despite saying that they are okay. So there are certainly limitations. But that being said, I think it shows a lot if you drop an email in the mailbox of your team, whatever, every morning, every evening, every week, whatever is the frequency that makes sense, because it basically shows that the communication channel is open. You show a piece of you when you let an email of yourself be in that mailbox. You can make phone calls with people that you know are maybe at particular risk for whatever reason, or maybe particularly likely to be afraid because they fall into a risk category of workers. They knows what conditions they might be facing. So I would be using a bit of your empathy and your imagination there, of thinking, okay, what people for what reason might be more or less afraid, what can I do, and pay some extra attention to these people. And otherwise, show presence, show that you're there, even digitally, through whatever works best. Obviously, we know video works better than only voice, but voice again is already better than only an email. So you'll need to
Yeah.
you'll
Here's
need
a
to.
here's a very tough question: is how do you do that if you know you're going to have to fire people, or if you've just fired people? How
Yeah,
do you do that in an environment where the company has said, "I'm sorry, we need to survive, and all of you, since the stores are closed, the shops are closed, everybody's on furlough. Here's the form to fill out for the government to give you some money. Good luck."
yeah.
How do you do that then?
That is a difficult conversation to have, even in the best of circumstances, and the best meaning, I guess, being face to face, being trained to do that. Even people that have done this many times comment when I'm doing classes on HR, for example, they say, okay, these are just the toughest conversations that I've ever had to have, because you know that you're putting someone in a very difficult situation. Preparation in general is something that helps show that you care, which is not maybe the same as changing the situation. If that is the situation, you may have to do it, but you can still do it in a way that demonstrates caring for the person as a person. And maybe there's even something concretely that you can do to help. Who knows? Because I know many people. For example, I've heard who worked in restaurants and other type of industries where things are completely closed down now. They find new temporary work in other places. Maybe some of them have training or background experience in something that relates to healthcare. Maybe a cook in a restaurant can start cooking in a hospital or in I don't know what. So even when that conversation is very difficult, and even more when it has to be done through digital means, I do think that there is a lot that you can do to demonstrate that you care. And sometimes, who knows, creative solutions are possible. Just the example that comes to mind is of the Swiss organization called Victorinox. They make these Swiss army knives, and they saw a tremendous drop, obviously, in their sales after exactly 9/11, because army knives from then on were forbidden in airplanes, and overnight, I mean, their sales dropped dramatically.
It's a great case study. It's a great case study as they reinvented themselves to a luggage company. Anneloes, we have a bunch of comments here about what happens next. Does this mean that we're all going to work from home forever? Are we going to change the layout of offices? Are we going to change the way people are hired? And there's a question about the young people coming out of university and business schools today. Are they going to be scarred for life? So if you look kind of, putting back your organizational design hat on, as you think about the kind of the implications for this thing and the scenarios you might envision over the next few years, where do you think this might take organization and the future of work?
Yeah, I mean, I guess obviously a lot will depend on how long this takes, which also will predict how long the new measures will have to last, how much we get used to it, how much we maybe get to see advantages of it. I think for sure what also will happen is that if before we were in a trend where we wanted more digital, we wanted more virtual, we wanted more non-office time, maybe, I mean, there is a big appreciation, I guess, when people come out of this for face-to-face time, for office time, for colleagues to hang out with at your coffee bar. So I do think that probably there is some sense of extra appreciation for what it means to be co-located and to have face-to-face contact. That being said, I also think we're just getting so many new competencies, even if I'm thinking just for us at IESE, in doing things digitally, that for sure will not go for every organization, but it is smart already now to start thinking what of this experience, what of the competencies we're developing, what of the new insights that we're learning, and how can we use that later on? And it might be on doing digital webinars, Zoom meetings, less travel, etc. But it might also be, earlier you mentioned the issue of trust. And I think there is also something, even if we go back to face-to-face situations, but we have learned, let's say, to trust people even when we are not co-located and we cannot monitor them. That also would certainly be a silver lining, I would say, to keep in your behavior later on. So I think it's probably just a matter of also here to start thinking about it already now. I heard someone just last week saying, I'm writing down everything, all the insights that I'm learning in my diary to see what later on we can do with it. So I would just say be sure to capture the learnings, even when right now you might still be focusing on many other things, but try to build in that reflection already now.
And Annelies, there's a couple of questions about the developing world, because part of our personal experience, mine or yours, is we're in a country which, even though we're being hard hit by the virus, civil society is under control, the stores are full. If you look at people in Ecuador, we had a student from Gemba from Ecuador, or from Zimbabwe. We had another person in a panel from the other day. Countries where people go to the morgue, they get their money, and they eat that evening. They cannot do lockdown. Now, if you're a human resources manager or a people person in these kinds of environments, it's a different situation, I guess.
Yeah. It breaks my heart to think about it, because it's true, like what we are experiencing here is peanuts as compared to the developing world. Also, just this morning I read an article about refugee camps. Refugee camp in Greece was closed down. It's just very, very hard to think about these situations.
Well, do you feel the care model, works really well in Holland and maybe in Europe and but maybe not over the world? Is the care model? There's a question here. Is it cultural specific or is it universal in your view?
Well, I think it's universal enough to be able to tailor it and tweak it to your specific context, I guess. For example, I could imagine acting and learning. That is something that for sure you could do in any that you could do that in the in developing countries as well. That is, I've had some students this year who with MBA students with strong experience and long time experience in African countries, and I've discussed quite a bit with them. And I guess the sense that you can do and you can learn from what you're doing, that is something that for sure you can do in all cultures. Envisioning the future might be even more important if people are in even more desperate times, I guess, to say, okay, how could we get out of it? Stimulating creativity. For sure, if you're someone with maybe a Western background taking care of developing countries in your task portfolio, well, see how you can stimulate the creativity in ways that you just wouldn't have thought about uh, with with the with the interpretation frame of your specific cultural background.
Professor
Um,
Anneloes Raes, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on this live broadcast. By the way, the session will be available on LinkedIn after the broadcast, so you can watch it again or forward it to other people. By the way, you can also look at this and all the other webinars we've been doing on IESE's website. That's www.iese.edu. We have a resources box full of these webinars um, and other material that our faculty have been producing to help people get through the crisis. And let me just remind you that next week we have two sessions, one on Monday at 4 o'clock with Connor Neal. He'll be talking about communication and some of the leadership challenges on that aspect. And then my colleague Miguel Jadot from the strategy department will be speaking on Tuesday. Unfortunately, Miguel will be in Spanish. But for those of you who understand Spanish, Miguel is an amazing lecturer, and he has a lot of real experience to bring. So anyway, thank you so much for joining us today, Anneloes, and thank all of you who have been watching us online. This is it for today's broadcast. Please keep safe, keep your people safe, and God bless.